You are listening to My Little Narcissist. I'm your host, Lyra Stone, and today I am going to be addressing some of the very common misconceptions people have about abuse. Now, I really felt this was important for me to kind of go into as a topic because a lot of the reasons that people have such a difficulty coming forward and discussing and talking about why it is that they were in this abusive situation, what was happening, all these issues. Like, there's so much shame centered around abuse, and there's just so much helplessness kind of centered around it, and a lot of misinformation and misconceptions about what it looks like, why it happened, etc. I think a lot of people have this kind of in their mind exceptionalism in their mindset. They're just like, well, if it happens, it must somehow be the victim's fault. Very common to victim blame. And I personally would never end up in such a situation. You know, people really have this mindset of there must be something wrong with the victim. The victim must have some kind of low self-esteem or some issue that caused her to end up in this situation. And should I really even feel sympathy for her or advocate for her or push for better like law reform, better like social justice understanding? Things like that. Like, a lot of people seem to really resist this idea that we owe rape survivors, domestic abuse survivors, any kind of sympathy, because they're just like, well, that sounds like something that's a you thing, and it's not really a me thing. And, you know, society doesn't really need to do much about this thing, even though if you look at any of the data, domestic violence and rape is an incredibly problematic issue that plagues our society. And in fact, if you look at the additional crimes being committed in the world or committed in our country, so many of those crimes often are tied into domestic violence and rape. And a lot of these men who get arrested for very serious crimes, up to and including murder, started out like the big signs, the big thing that kind of created a lot of this bad behavior, started with their abuse and treatment of women. So if we kind of start there and start to pay attention to women's stories and men's stories too, but predominantly women's stories, because women are the ones most at risk in cases of domestic violence and rape. Like, if we really start to pay attention to that demographic and we really start to kind of, as a society, stand up and say, stuff needs to be done about this, we need to take this more seriously as a nation, well, then we're going to see that affecting a lot of crime. We're going to see that kind of really, I think, improving things in as far as other issues in society. And so by focusing on this, we actually improve things on a much larger scale. So that would be my first argument as to why we should make domestic violence and rape and take it seriously. Never mind that just in general, if you see someone struggling and suffering through crimes that we are not taking seriously, we just should feel, I think, naturally inside of ourselves an urge to do something about it because, well, that's empathy. That's having a conscience. That's just having a moral code, a sense of what is right and wrong. You know, if a woman is being hit or is being sexually assaulted, even if she's not your cousin or she's not your sister or you have no tie-ins to that person, you know, there can still be a sense of empathy, of connection, of wanting to right those wrongs, even if you've never encountered it, or even if you're a man who maybe feels more insulated from things like abuse or rape. Even though I do want to emphasize, men get abused and raped too. It's not like just being a man means that you're like not going to somehow encounter this problem. But women, of course, are much more at risk. And I think that should probably go into the first misconception, a big argument you'll often hear, and that is this kind of almost clapback, this knee-jerk defensiveness of being like, well, women abuse too, and who's to say? And, you know, how dare you get on to men when women do it too? And, you know, it is interesting because there is a kind of normalization of sorts of women's violence. Like, I was sitting in my living room and doing some things, and I put on My Name is Earl, which is, you know, a show from like 2005, I want to say. And in it, like just in the first or few episodes, there's like quite a lot of violence conducted by women. You see his ex-wife Joy throwing things at him. You see an old woman, a kind of woman in I think her 70s, hitting him across the head with a phone. Now, this whole trope of women kind of being violent, backhanding men, and throwing something at their heads, it seems to be done in almost a comedic sense. Like they're just like, how hilarious! This old lady just cold clocked him across the head. Now, violence is, of course, not good. People should not be committing acts of violence against one another in real life. Comedy, of course, being comedy, it's exaggeratory, right? But I mean, we as a nation, we should hopefully have evolved as human beings enough to be like, hey, don't hit people, right? But why is it that comedically, women's violence is kind of seen as just a funny thing, as a ha-ha, look at Earl, the main character in the show. Look at him kind of getting these women so riled up that they're hitting him, that they're committing violence against him, and how funny is that? Now, I think the reason we think of it as funny is because women are smaller, women are not as prone towards warfare and just the things that men have traditionally societally done. Men are taller, typically. Men just have more of a physical presence than women do. Women's bodies are built very differently from men's bodies. And so if you reverse this to where now Earl Hickey's walking in and he's throwing a bottle at Joy, or he's cold clocking an old lady across the head with the phone, you would not laugh. You would gasp and you would be horrified. And that's because if you look at the data, 95% of domestic violence cases is going to end with women hospitalized, or women very much beaten up and injured seriously. And that's because men are physically much stronger than women. And it does definitely lend to a different issue that's altogether separate, because, the problem, of course, with any social justice movement is, how do you even begin to address all of it? Because, men should never hit women. People shouldn't be hitting people regardless. But men doing acts of violence against women is deeply problematic because it can kill them. Women are very scared of violence for good reason. If a woman is violent towards a man, he might get very angry about it. He might get very distressed, annoyed, and these things. But if violence is committed against a woman by a man, she's going to often feel a great deal of intimidation, a great deal of fear. This is a much more serious situation for her. And I'm not saying either one is correct. I'm just saying the amount of risk, the amount of power that a man can assume by being physically violent is a lot greater. We're talking about a life being at risk, while I'm pretty sure an old lady cold clocking him with the phone, which is comical in the show, she's very unlikely to kill him or to hospitalize him. Shouldn't be doing it. But because she's an old, frail lady, it's kind of seen as funny. It's seen as, oh, well, she's not really going to hurt him. She's more just very upset, and this is the only way for her to get his attention because he's a big, lumbering lug of a bit of a moron, and she's just like, I'm really upset. You're not going to hear it. Let me do something dramatic to really illustrate the point. And then this, of course, is because he got her son in prison. This is a side note because it's just the plot line for the story. But anyway, violence is wrong. Violence is wrong. But when women do it, it seldom ends in death or hospitalization. When men do it, it can end very much so in both. And the tactics used in violence when men are doing it is to often silence, to forcibly cause a person to submit to things that they don't want to submit to, such as sexual assault or coercion, financial coercion. If you can literally beat a person down to submission, they are going to be subjected to things that they do not consent or agree to. Now, if a woman hits a guy, and you shouldn't hit a guy, I'm not saying that, but if a woman hits a guy or whatever, there's a violence, and there are, of course, exceptions, if the woman is a great deal bigger than the guy, which can happen, but by and large, if a woman does this, it's probably, typically not going to reinforce these kinds of extreme behaviors. It's not going to really suddenly make the guy be so afraid of her that he, will do whatever she says. Oftentimes in a lot of these cases, if a woman ever does like react to such an extreme level, it might alert the guy that she's really pissed off, obviously. But it's usually not going to alter his entire behavior around her and make him afraid for his life. And so when we discuss abuse and physical violence specifically, it does need to be emphasized that the more serious problem is, of course, men hitting women. And there's a lot of that going on. Another really misconception out there is that when they think of men hitting women or men beating up women and hospitalizing them, they often think of like somebody who's like lower class, someone who is working class, who doesn't have a lot of status or prestige in society. And of course, that's not true at all. That is a complete misconception. Some of the data shows that up to 40% of police officers, the men and women who are allegedly defending us and, kind of upholding the criminal law system or whatever, like, they're domestic violence. They commit acts of domestic violence. Up to 40%, they say. That's a huge number. And also, can you just imagine being a wife and your husband is law enforcement? How on earth do you escape that? How on earth do you get justice if he has your kids, your home, everything else? Like, what do? You can't go to the police because he is the police. And this can be especially scary if he's like in a high position in the police. And this has been a story that's been repeated a lot in like news articles and things. And it's not just the police, you see, Ron Jeremy just got in trouble today. I think it was for 21 cases of sexual assault. And he's a porn star. He doesn't necessarily have a lot of clout. People don't look at him as an upstanding citizen. But then you look at other people who have huge high positions, like, say, a president. Donald Trump has had so many allegations of rape, of assault, violence. There's even a case of him raping an underage girl. I think she was 13 when that court, thing was written out. And so, a president. So we're talking all the way at the top. And, if you look back at our history and all that stuff, with JFK, I know there were allegations. And of course, there's the infamous Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton had cases against him of harassment and whatnot. I'm not referring, of course, to Monica Lewinsky, which seemingly had consent to it and there was no violence. But it still obviously shows people at the very top can mistreat women and get away with it. You'll see it with doctors. The studies done on lawyers and doctors, people that make really good money, really high up in society, doctors score really high for violence against their wives and for murdering their wives. Look it up. So the whole point is that this is happening in every category of class, from upper to middle to lower. There seems to be no, over-tipment of one or the other. It's possible if you're working class, you get caught more often. But anyway, this is something that literally affects everyone, regardless of their income, regardless of their occupation, regardless of a lot of things. It's like this is a cultural issue, not a class issue. And additionally, now we're going to get into more of the more serious stuff, the stuff that really starts to mess with the victims' minds. And a big one is more we're going to go into the psychology, the actual scenarios. Because I'm just talking about statistics right now, and I'm saying, 7 out of 10, and, 95%, and 40%, and I'm doing things like that. But now I'm kind of going to go more into the deep and personal. I'm going to try to actually illustrate to you some of the scenarios, so maybe it can help you see in your mind how this can happen and how it's not the victim's fault. In fact, this is human nature. Human nature often works against itself in cases of domestic violence because the men or women, although I am focusing on man-on-woman crime because this is where the major issue is arising, but an abuser, a man or a person who is raping somebody or beating somebody or kind of doing really abusive criminal acts, they're obviously not mentally well. They're not mentally sane. They have serious mental health issues. And they are operating outside of how normal human beings operate. And that really needs to be emphasized. Because if you're a quote unquote normal human being, sure, maybe you have codependency issues, or maybe you were abused as a child. There are correlations for those things. So yes, there is actually, you're more likely to become a victim of domestic violence or rape if certain tragic things happen to you in your childhood, or if you do have certain, if you're like a people pleaser, a rescuer, if you tend to put others well before yourself in a lot of scenarios, things like that. Yes, you're obviously going to be more frequently targeted or be more at risk, especially if you are isolated. If, say, you don't have a strong support system, like maybe your family's in another country, or your mom died, or something like that, where you don't have a support system, you are also at risk, which is really sad because what we're talking about is predatorial behavior. This is much like outside of rape or domestic violence, anybody can be vulnerable to predatorial, criminal behaviors on the basis of that kind of isolation. If a person lives alone in a nice house with nice things in an area that has a crime issue, they're going to be more likely to maybe have their house broken into. They don't have as much of a defense there. That doesn't mean, however, that it's their fault if their house gets robbed. That seems to be a pretty egregious argument to make, to look at the victim and say, well, how shitty for you, but honestly, what were you doing living alone? It's like, well, I'm 70 and my, didn't have kids and my husband died and da-da-da-da-da-da. Like, never mind the reason why this woman's living alone. Like, that seems like a ridiculous thing to even bring up. People should be able to freely live alone or not live alone and not have their houses broken into. But people are very quick to go and look at the victim, which is also human nature, I think. Human nature, we tend to put ourselves in the shoes of the people we relate to. And we tend to think of ourselves in terms of the victim. How many times do we think of ourselves in terms of the perpetrator, as the criminal? Not often. So when we just start looking in the kind of like the shoes of the victim, we tend to completely ignore the criminal. And this is especially true in the case of rape and domestic violence, because we have, for a very long time, as a community, as a culture, kind of viewed women as a second class. We've had a lot of issues, like in terms of how women haven't had the same rights as men. They couldn't attend the same schools. They couldn't they didn't achieve the vote until into the 1900s. They weren't able to own property until close to the 1900s. There was no legal protections for them. There were no women who were lawyers. There were no women who were politicians. There were no women who could own businesses freely. I remember looking at one funny statistic. It was about women who owned bars. Like, say a woman owned a bar back in the day. And I only am thinking of this because they're still on the books. And I'm laughing at laws that are still in the books that obviously have become obsolete and are kind of comical now. But there are laws, like, for example, how did it go? Like, a woman couldn't serve behind a bar. Like, they weren't allowed to be bartenders or something. And this one woman owned her own bar. And she's like, listen, I should be able to serve my customers behind my bar. And she actually lost that case. And I'm doing a terrible job kind of going on this random diatribe. But it illustrates, of course, kind of like the sexism, the lack of power women had had and continue to have in society. And when women don't have a lot of power, or none, and, are kind of perceived as extensions or property of men, they're not really seen outside of the guise of being mothers and being married and being wives, like as kind of like, all under the authority of the male gaze. Like, that's a problem, because then when they say, hey, I want a divorce, or hey, I'm being beaten or raped, people tend to just assign blame to them and say, well, what were you doing? Women are supposed to make men happy. Women are supposed to be their conscience. That's a very common one. And, this is like kind of the co-option of identity. And, this is, of course, a problem, and we're working on it as a society. I think you would be very hard-pressed, unless you're like in an incel meeting or a meeting with the KKK, to find men out there who still believe that. Most men are going to be like, yeah, women should go out and have jobs and, have educations and do whatever the hell they want, just like we can. That's most men. And additionally, most men would say women should not get raped and women should not get beaten. I am not saying that this is somehow an attitude that's like in general still existing. However, subconsciously, we still assign blame incorrectly because we still kind of have programmed in our mindset that it's just simply the way it is. This is how society is structured. Like the people in power, we don't often want to hold accountable as often because they have power. That's intimidating. That can work against you. And, when you kind of punch down, so to speak, to someone who has less power or no power, well, it's a lot easier. There's a lot more comfortableness in that. And you don't have to feel the fear of going after a system that could harm you if you get too loud about it, because they have the money, they have the authority to challenge your free speech. And thankfully we live in America where, people have free speech and stuff, but let's also be real about this. We're also not dumb. We know that we put ourselves at risk when we stand up to certain people. And in the case of domestic violence or rape, the men doing it obviously are very dangerous, hence why they're doing these things. And if you add in the fact that there's, say, Bill Cosby, a national icon who has immense star power, now you're really afraid to go after that man, even if it's obvious. I mean, in this case, it was extremely obvious he was a criminal. But people were very much like, ugh, but he did such good things for the black community, and he did. And he's done such things, good things for society, and he's really funny, and I love that Jell-O commercial. And when it's connected in that way, it can be very problematic. People don't want to believe it because it's a beneficial thing for them to not believe it. And they don't want to receive cultural backlash by standing up against it. So we're also dealing with things like that, like why defend somebody who I get no benefit defending on a personal level, especially if the guy who's doing it is my doctor or my preacher or something like that. I mean, then it's really, really bad. Or my president, It's much better to say that woman's crazy, that can't be provable, what was she wearing, things like that. And that gets, of course, into the other stuff, like the what was she wearing thing. Again, that goes back to blaming the victim. Well, was she enticing him? Lots of guys use this argument. I remember my lawyer even using this argument of she was asking for it. Well, she was asking for it, or she was flirting. And this is an interesting and sad thing. And I'm going to go into this, and this is really sad but very true. Women who have been molested as children, which is very common. I think with girls, it's about 1 in 4. So think about that statistic for a second. 1 in 4 of them, a quarter of them. But anyway, have been molested as children. When you're molested as a child, you often go one of 2 different ways, depending on how the encounter was. And that is you either become very afraid of sexual contact, you kind of pull into yourself. You can have, of course, depression and weight issues. I knew one woman who actually gained a considerable amount of weight because she wanted for men to not look at her. And so she was just like, if I make myself as unappealing as possible, I won't be looked at and I'll be safe. How sad is that? But on the other hand, if, say, you're introduced to it and it happens usually with a family member or somebody that is trusted, which is also sick and sad. It's horrifying. It's very horrifying. And also, just FYI, I've known lots of women that this has happened to, and a few men. And the really sad part is some of them did come forward and they got victim blamed for it. Even at the age of 7, they were told, well, what did you do? Well, you must have misunderstood. Well, you know that you're too friendly with him anyway, and things like that. It's really sad. I've only ever known of one successful case where something was really, really done about it to make sure that man wouldn't get a hold of her anymore. And this is just me anecdotally. I'm not talking about stats, but I've talked to a lot of people this has happened to. And the sad thing is, yeah, nothing is typically done. These men don't see a courtroom, and often the girls, and sometimes the boys, are blamed. So, and this is very psychologically damaging. But in some of these scenarios, these kids go on to be incredibly hypersexual. They start to define their entire value by attention, by sexual attention. They're basically given something that they don't even understand. Also, maybe it felt good, and now they're chasing after it, like Jason Stackhouse in True Blood. I don't know why I want to make that reference. But you find out later in the season or in the storyline, spoiler alert, can you tell I watched a lot of TV during the pandemic? But anyway, when this guy, he was known for being hypersexual. He's handsome. He loved to have sex with all the women in his town, etc., and so forth. And eventually, later on in like the show, you find out his old teacher comes back into town, and you find out that she had sex with him when he was really young, 15 or something, and she molested him. That's statutory rape, and he doesn't even connect until after he has sex with her again. He's just all of a sudden it kind of hit him. He was like, I'm so hypersexual. I feel like there's a hole inside of me. I feel like I'm not good enough. And I'm thinking, what you did to me really kind of created this issue I have, this unhealthy connection I have to sex. And, all of this is going to lead to an unhealthy relationship with sex, of course. It's just a matter of how that manifests. And some people, it manifests, they become angry, or they become sad, or they become super fat, or they become it can go across the board, but a lot of times they become hypersexual. And when you're dealing with young girls who are hypersexual, and say you're around them, say you're a man in your 30s and this 15-year-old girl who, has a pretty face and whatnot, is acting hypersexual. And then say you do inappropriate things with her, and then you say, well, she wanted it. That just irritates the hell out of me. Because it really, I think, goes to a different problem we have, which is feeling that men can't control themselves. Somehow men have this ape brain that prevents them from handling their behaviors once they have an erection. And it's so not true. Men are just as capable as women to abstain. They're just as capable of understanding that the child in front of them is not a viable sex partner. They're choosing to ignore it because they can get away with it. And the men that do this are choosing to ignore it because they're criminals. They're bad men. And this child is not going to have a great experience by this. She's going to continue to feel unsafe and traumatized by unhealthy relationships. And that's going to continue to play into her life. And she's going to continue to have a lot of problems. And basically, because of what these men did to her as children, as a child, they've robbed her of potentially having a very happy, thriving, normal life, with a good family, and additionally, often groomed her for further mistreatment in her adult life, which again goes back to abuse victims most certainly can have kind of a look to them, but it certainly is not the case universally. You can come from the best family, never once had a creepy uncle, and still end up abused. This can happen to anyone. But if you have been hypersexualized, or if you have had, all this trauma from, these things, it does increase your chances. And that's really, 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 really unfortunate. No person should come into the world and be subjected to that kind of torture from adults who they should feel safe with, who they should feel mentored by. And this is a problem with society. This is a problem because, again, these bad criminal men, these predators, because they are predators, they're getting away with it because they're not being held accountable. The chances of them getting away with it is so very, very, very high because we don't make it an issue. And my friends, because I was born, I'm a millennial, and I remember what it was like in the early 2000s. And It was terrible. Like, I mean, as far as what we were subjected to, things that just normal young girls are subjected to, all of us by and large, subjected to if you have any kind of circumstances in your life that is going to make you vulnerable. Because predators seek out people who are vulnerable. And that's a sick world. You don't want to live in a world like that. Because, again, it's not just in the case of molestation or the case of physical violence if you're a girl. If any time you fall on bad times, and instead of our society having safety nets for that or having resources to help pull you back up again, because we all fall on bad times, bad circumstances happen. We live in a chaotic universe that, where things can happen. Tomorrow you could get hit by a bus, you can lose your legs, become a paraplegic, and have to completely reinvent how you make money, how you have shelter, all these things, because you became paraplegic suddenly. And if there's not programs in place, you just end up on the street, potentially, if you didn't have family. And this could happen overnight, when before maybe you were making six figures and you were, at the top of your world. It can happen like that. And when you have predatorial people then come in the moment you lose your legs at the moment, and then they're just like, great, now I can come in and I can take your house. Now I can come in and I can remove money from your bank account. Say you're paraplegic and you go to the doctor and the doctor can fix your legs, but he's going to make more money, or she's going to make more money by having you crippled. So she continues to have you be crippled. I'm using this as outlandish scenarios, but it kind of goes to show predatorial people, when allowed to run amok, can do horrific damage to everybody, and it destroys society as a whole. Then we don't see any progress. The beauty of our structures, of our country, is that we, as a democracy with free speech and whatnot, and a pretty decent community and culture, if bad things happen, we have our churches and things, but we also just have these moral codes we live by to help one another out. And we do that because we have consciences and all these things. But if we allow predatorial people to run amok and to take advantage and to not be held accountable, this is what happens. Everything gets corroded. After a while, more people are going to start thinking predatorially. And I personally believe that you can't really fix predatorial people. I think that sometimes people are just born evil. I hate to say that, maybe not born evil, but for whatever reason, they've chosen evil, and evil has manifested, or we can just call it mental illness, like narcissistic personality disorder, which is what this podcast is about. Narcissistic personality disorder develops at a pretty young age of around 6 or 7, and one could argue, oh, that kid's a victim then. Well, sure, I guess, because there were scenarios in that guy's life where, his mother and his father didn't give him any kind of emotional support. They only paid attention to exterior things he was doing, which caused him, when he felt unsafe, to create a false self. And then over time, that kind of false self took over, and then he lost all ability to display empathy, etc., and it just kind of became about keeping the false self going. And now you have NPD, an incurable personality disorder that often leads to heartache, trauma, and chaos in the lives of anybody that person comes in contact with on a deep personal level. On a surface level, a guy with NPD can be fine. He can actually be quite fun, buy you shots, you see lots of characters on TV shows where the persons display egregious narcissistic traits, if not full-blown NPD, and they're almost seen as a fun a friend, and you're just isn't he hilarious? I'm trying to think of a media example, because I make TV references. One that we often find endearing in that cartoon that's been around forever, American Dad. In the cartoon American Dad, you have the alien Roger. Roger obviously has no empathy. Roger's very selfish and entitled, and he does some really messed up things to get what he wants. I mean, he kind of has NPD, but an alien NPD, I suppose. But of course, this is a cartoon where it's going to be comedic, and so Roger trying to, steal somebody's face and kill them because he wants to wear their face, because, he wants to do a bit. that's just seen as comedic. And they always forgive him and they always enable him because that's just how Roger be. Well, obviously, anyway, but the problem is like, yes, predators, criminals, there were periods in their childhood where they responded by becoming criminals themselves. And I find it really fascinating that a lot of rapists, a lot, but not all, a lot of rapists, a lot of abusers, a lot of people that do really criminal behaviors to other people, right up to, serial killers, they had those things done to them. And, when you're subjected to, say, being beaten by a belt every day by your drunk dad or whatever, your brain is not going to function very well. And if he does it young enough, yes, you could very much end up becoming a psychopath or becoming a sociopath or becoming somebody with NPD. Also, you could go the other way. You can become very codependent. You can have very low self-esteem, and you can become preyed upon by psychopaths and sociopaths because you have never built up any self-worth owing to being beaten all the time and told you're worthless. These are all sad, kind of extreme scenarios, but what I'm trying to express is it's not as extreme as you'd think. It's not as uncommon as you'd think. And because we don't address it as a society, it continues to create a cycle. And these cycles just keep going over and over and over and over again. And you know that it could be better in other places. If you look at other places where they have a better legal system for, say, women, and for protecting women and children, you see improvements to everything as a whole. The U.S. is just kind of behind. I know we like to think of ourselves as advanced, but in this scenario, we're not. And we've already seen evidence that there's improvement to society as a whole when we take these things seriously. But now to get to the more personal things. One, like a woman who's being abused, who's experiencing domestic violence and, say, rape, or just psychological and emotional torment, which is arguably just as bad, but, for the sake, just being abused, put it in the category of abuse. Sometimes people will ask, well, how could somebody love a jerk like that? How could somebody love a jerk like that? Because, sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes the guy is not just a jerk to her, he's a jerk to everybody. Other times, the guy is deeply charismatic and awesome, and then he's only a jerk to her in private. But if they're able to be convinced that, yes, this guy is a jerk, this guy is a criminal, this guy is a predator, and maybe they're able to get to that point, they're still going to ask, but why did she love him? Why did she love a jerk? The moment he hit her in the face, or the moment he, started just saying these horrible things to her, or financially abusing her, isolating her from her friends and family, why didn't she just leave? And it's like, oh, did she just have low self-esteem? Did she just not value herself? And the argument is that she did, I think, what every human being, that's normal at least, does. We make excuses and we justify because we love that person. When we all do bad things, we all can be selfish, we all can call people jerks, we all can say irrational, heated things. None of us are exempted from bad behavior. And so let's say when he does something really egregious, like say he hits her or something, but they had just gone to Martha's Vineyard a week ago, or she had just met his mother for the first time, and they had made brownies, and his mother was so sweet, and she learned all about her boyfriend's childhood and how much, and it's very complicated. Why did she love this jerk? Well, oftentimes she loves this jerk because there's things to love about him. No jerk is going to just walk around with demon horns, raping and beating everybody and pillaging everything. For whatever reason, I thought of King David in the Old Testament. This guy was considered God's beloved. But if you read the Old Testament, he was a war criminal that went out and raped and pillaged and burned literally everything to the ground. He was he didn't just kill the men, he killed the women, he killed the children, hell, he killed the house cats. Like, he was a brutal war criminal, but people call him beloved. They say he was a great guy. He was so nice to his 8 wives. And, other than that Bathsheba incident, like, just seemed to be a great dude. God loved him. And I'm sorry, that was a side note. It's the Bible part in me, but I'm just like, yeah, but was he, raping, murdering, and pillaging villages? This is obviously a different time, a different context, not really applicable to just normal societal days where most guys don't go off like Vikings. But anyway, yeah, she loved him because there were things to love about him. My abuser, there were so many things I loved about him. He was so smart. He was very smart. I thought that was so sexy about him. He was such a smart guy. I liked his hair. That's an odd one. I liked his mother. I liked a few of his friends. I, and he was gentle to me sometimes. He was very familiar. He allowed me in many ways, especially in the beginning, to be myself, to overly be myself, because that was love bombing. That's a side note. He played tennis with me. We went hiking together. We traveled the United States together. We had things in common. And so all of these things are happening. And so I would have this juxtapositioning in my mind of this really happy, loving memory of holding his hand on a beach looking at a silver dollar. And then right beside it would be him spitting in my face and kicking me repeatedly in the side, calling me a whore, and then raping me. I know that's graphic, but, such is the way. The point is that I loved this jerk because there were things about him to love. And that's what really gets victims trapped. Like, when it comes to intimate partners, this is in some ways a choice. You're hopefully of adult age. And you meet them and you fall in love with them. And then, they kind of, maybe you get married and then you become a family. But, in places like when you're with a family, there's like the very serious issue of, well, of course you love the jerk in the sense that it's like a family member because they're family. How many excuses do we make for our brother who's an addict or something? And all the things, like, it takes so much love when you're just dealing with somebody who's an addict. Because one of my siblings was an addict. I love him. He is a good person. But when he was an addict, he was not a good person. But he's family. And if I had met him on the street, I would have told him, go fuck yourself. You're a bad person. You're a jerk. There wouldn't have been much investment in him. But he was family. And as family, I loved him. And that love extended to a very deep level. And sometimes when I really get annoyed at the lack of imagination and the lack of empathy when people see this woman, take R. Kelly, I don't know. R. Kelly groomed a bunch of girls, usually young teenage girls, and, subjected them to horrific sex acts and additionally, even forced one of them to have an abortion. I know that just came out, and all these just really messed up things. And I remember when that one came out, people being like, wait, he's still not in prison? That was the takeaway. Because, my goodness, there's been documentaries out about this. And all of these women that were teenagers coming forward, and he's still out there. Now, and this kind of goes back to, of course, they keep doing it. They're not being held accountable. These crimes, horrific crimes, are not being addressed as a society, and people are still offering excuses. These teenage girls who get groomed for years and years and years and years and years and years by him, and then finally, he discards them or whatever, or they escape, and then they're just left broken, just completely psychologically shattered. People just look at them very coldly, and they're just like, well, that was dumb. You shouldn't have stayed with that jerk. And I'm just like, what? How cruel, how cold, how callous can you be that you're just looking at this person who had horrific things done to her? It's like, but you could have left. The door was open. They didn't have you chained down to a table. They didn't have you, other than that one guy that, remember when he had the women in his basement for, anyway, he didn't lock you in the basement like that one dude did. No. He did something in some ways arguably worse. Stockholm Syndrome, which is, again, a human thing. Very, very human. You think Stockholm Syndrome only extends to that, I don't know, that rich woman, what was her name? And the guys, the terrorists, and then she joined them, Patty Hearst. You think Patty Hearst is the only person that's ever encountered Stockholm Syndrome? It is a normal phenomenon where you're subjected to horrific torment by somebody. And then that person then goes to you while you're starving and bleeding and offers you a sandwich. And you're hungry. And you eat that sandwich, and then you're thankful to them. You're attached to them. Thank you for the sandwich. And maybe they're kind. Maybe they bandage up your face a little. And even though your brain is telling you, this is the guy that bruised my face, this is the guy that starved me, you're additionally having a chemical release that's saying, this is the guy that's fixing my face. This is the guy that's feeding me. Isn't that sick? But this happens usually over time. At first, the guy's going to be taking care of you and feeding you. And then over time, as you're attached to them, love them, care for them, then they're going to start to do those things. And a lot of these young girls haven't received a whole lot of love. And usually predators and abusers, they offer them all kinds of love and support and kindness. In the beginning, my ex-abuser, he really gave me so much love. I felt so seen. I never thought I could fall in love like I did with him. I really didn't think it was possible. It was like being on cloud nine. I felt like I had arrived. My parents had a very close relationship. I mean, codependent, sure. But, I wanted to fall in love. I wanted to have a life partner. And, I would just, and I gave so much of my energy and time into helping him. I wanted him to succeed, and he wanted to succeed too, and he started to exploit me, and he started to make more demands of me, and I just kept thinking, but it'll switch back. Eventually he'll eventually heal, and it'll get better. But no, it got worse. And then the sexual entitlement started happening. And then it went a step further from sexual entitlement to sexual coercion. And then it went a little further from sexual coercion to sexual assault. And then it went a little further until one day he's just full-on raping me. And this is heartbreaking. Because remember, holding hands, looking at a silver dollar, after having lunch with his mother, after playing pool with his friends of over 10 years. It is so psychologically and painfully, and then there's the additional issues of, by that point, you could have a home together. By that point, you could have children together. And and you really think that lots of these women can afford lawyers? Also, keep in mind, say they were married to a cop. Do you really think they can go, if they come out, and their husband's mother that they have lunch with finds out, and we live in a society where we blame women for everything. You really think, sometimes it's better to just duck and allow it and maybe try to, and this is really sad, negotiate with the terrorist. I did that for so long, where I was just if I can just convince him that what he's doing is wrong. I remember him strangling me and me trying to explain to him calmly afterwards, you cannot choke and strangle me. As if somehow this argument was going to suddenly make a conscience develop inside of him, and he was going to realize the error of his ways. Because it was so sick with my abuser, I literally thought he couldn't remember doing it, because he would act like he hadn't done anything. Literally in a minute. And you're left questioning your entire reality. And, I would even take pictures of the bruises to look at them. And all these things just to be they happened. They happened. Because, or the gaslighting. When they say this and then, I'm going to record him one day. I recorded some of these things. Not to throw in his face or whatever. This is for myself. I recorded some of these things of him saying, oh yeah, we're going to do this, and then this is going to happen, and then this will happen afterwards. And then the next day, he would say, oh, no, that didn't happen, and that's not going to happen, and you're crazy. and this is a person who used to hold me and who used to laugh with me, the ways that only couples can, and just felt completely seen by him. Until one day I realized he didn't see me at all. I didn't exist to this man except as something to use. And when he discarded me, it was like I I had no personality to me. I was not a person. I was just a thing that he had, and then he didn't need anymore. And it was really torturous, but very, of course, blissful, because he had just tried to. It was nuts. He had become so violent by that point that, I mean, I had been trying to get out. It was a mess, and any abuse victim will tell you, like, actually, usually won't tell you, because to get out is hell. Getting out is the worst part. And who wants to do that? It's kind of like standing on the edge of a cliffside looking down at like the deep water. And everybody does it, say it's a sanctioned area, and you're not going to die probably. You're going to probably be fine. But that moment of leaping off that cliff, it's like, well, of course that creates euphoria usually once you've succeeded, which arguably it does. But the point is, it's that sensation, like getting up to the moment you have to do it. But the dread is so much worse, because you might die, because everything might completely go to shit. And like the odds are sometimes stacked in the favor of that. But it has to get so bad that, if you don't, you're going to die for sure. Or it's going to get arguably worse. To get to that scenario where it is life or death. And a lot of women, we make the gamble wrong. I came extremely close to being simply another Hallmark Channel movie story of a man who killed his partner, his wife, his girlfriend. I became this close to being one of those because I kept gambling. I kept thinking, well, maybe if I get him into therapy, maybe if I get him into church, as long as I don't tell anyone what's happening, then I can get him to stop. And there's that too. We keep quiet. Our abusers will typically go out and do the most elaborate smear campaigns against us. Tell everybody that we're hysterical, we're crazy, we threw bottles at their heads, because guess what? Spoiler alert, when you're being subjected to horrific violence, you're going to do something cray at some point. And guess what? That reaction will forever be used against you, and they will claim until the cows come home you are just the same as them. Which is the worst feeling on the planet. It's not equivalent. It's not right. But all you can think of is like that you're so ashamed because that's not who you are. And so anyway, there's that too. So it's just a horrible scenario. Getting out, victims usually never see justice. What they often will see is the biggest betrayals of their lives in the quest to simply be free of a man trying to murder them. It goes again back to, we don't hold them accountable. If we lived in a better society where people recognize these things, and where if a woman comes forward and says, this man's raping and beating me, people are going to instantly believe her regardless of the circumstances, because they understand that women don't make this up. And the women that do allegedly make this up, like, because they say, oh, some women lie, and I do know of a scenario where that was, in fact, the case. That woman was a stranger, for one thing. And any of the scenarios I've heard of some women lie or whatever, I know that some women lie. But some people also lie about having their houses broken into as well. When you look at the data, the chances of her lying, extremely, extremely small. Far more likely is she's telling the truth. And not only is she telling the truth, it's probably worse than what she's saying. I think a lot of people tend to think you're exaggerating. I know people do with me if I do talk about it. Like, they think, oh, she must be exaggerating. No, 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 no. I am underselling what's happened. I am actually doing the opposite, because I am too ashamed to tell people how bad it was. I'll tell you, like, for example, have you ever had piss cover you? He literally took a jar of his own piss and dumped it on me. This would be an example of something I don't typically tell people. Because if you've had piss dumped on your head and you still stay with that man, people tend to look at you like you are a completely idiotic person. Granted, I can see why. Because they don't understand that Even at the point where I'm having piss dumped on me, which, yes, I should probably stop bringing that up because I'm starting to feel really embarrassed. All I can think of is, I mean, by that point I was trying to, you still have all of this, so you can't just walk away from everything. Like they are enmeshed and tied into your entire life. And a lot of these people, when they're being subjected to something on that level, they may not have anywhere else to go. Or that scenario that they could potentially go to might be worse. So, this is just stop it with the whole like, oh, you must be an idiot thing. Maybe, you know what, I will own that. I can definitely look back now, and since I am healed enough and gone, that wasn't smart. I wish I had done that instead. There was definitely a moment in the very beginning, the one takeaway I will take for anybody who's listening that is a victim of abuse or whatever, or is afraid of being a victim of abuse, I should say. If you end up in a scenario where the person is abusive to you, leave immediately the first time. Do not stay, because if you stay, you get trauma bonded. And the more it happens, the deeper the attachment and the bond gets. And I mean, it's for both. It's for both parties. My trauma bond with that man was so, so deep. They say it's worse than quitting heroin. And I've never done heroin, but I would easily believe that. It is worse than quitting heroin because the chemicals in your brain they're going to scream at you to stay with this man if you keep making excuses at the beginning for his behavior. If you've been together for 6 months or a year and then he decides one day to get drunk and, force you to have sex with him or hit you, he knows what he's doing. Doesn't matter how drunk he is. He knows what he's doing. He's testing a boundary, and he will do it again, and it will get worse, because if you accept it, it's game over. Like, there's just some lines people literally cross deliberately, and people do it like in subtle ways, and they start that way because they want to get to that point. They're criminal, they're predatorial, they're just evil people. And if you wake up the next day and say what you did was wrong, and they say, oh, you're right, baby, oh, I don't know what I was thinking, but I just love you so much, I promise it won't happen again, it's going to happen again. It's going to happen again and again and again. It may not happen for like another 6 months. It may not happen in quite the same way, but yes, it will absolutely happen again. You have to leave the moment they do a criminal act against you, period. Now, the other stuff, psychological, emotional, nobody should call you a jerk. Nobody should tell you just mean things or gaslight you or do things like that. Psychological abuse is terrible as well. We all engage sometimes in bad behaviors when we're upset. That can be a little harder to determine at what point are you becoming subjected to inhuman criminal. I argue that psychological can be criminal. I know there's not necessarily laws for it, because how does one create laws for that? But of course, I do believe after a while, the torment can definitely be at that level. In fact, I would also argue that physical violence it doesn't get that bad, like the physical where they're hitting you, unless they're doing something almost equally bad on the psychological or emotional level. Like they have to reinforce it. It's kind of like putting a nail in it so it'll stick. So that's my 2 cents about that. Now, and I think I've really then addressed the bigger question, which was the other question that everybody asked, why did she stay? I think I elaborated quite a bit on why she stays. Of course, she stays for all the reasons a person would. With that poor 17-year-old with R. Kelly, she stayed because first off, she was a teenager. He was grooming her. I mean, he was using the psychological advantage that we have over children. And that irritates the hell out of me too. It's like, if we wanted to, manipulating a kid to do things for us, especially if we are a music star, if we're a millionaire musician, it's pretty easy to manipulate a kid to do what we want. And for people to be like, well, why did she stay? Well, of course, he he was a multimillionaire like star. And then of course there's sick people who will go, well, it sounds like she had a good deal. No. It is never a good deal to be psychologically, physically, sexually, abused. That there's no payment that's enough for that. You end up broken. You end up committing suicide. You end up dysfunctional to the point that you can't hold down a job. You could get murdered by the guy. Things are terrible in that scenario. There's never enough money or enough status that's going to suddenly compensate for it and be like, well, yes, he stuck it in her ass, when she begged him not to, but he did give her $50K afterwards. It's like, that's horrible. That's horrible. And for the people out there that's like, I don't know, $50K is pretty nice. Go screw yourselves. Actually, that's probably a bad thing to say after the illustration. But the point is, it's like you don't understand the absolute torment of being raped versus consenting to something because they're giving you $50K, being a prostitute basically, versus being raped. Different, number one. It's the help, and number two, children, children are supposed to be protected. Their brains, their maturity, everything is not developed enough for them to make the kinds of decisions that they need to make as adults, that they can do with authority, because hopefully they've been trained and mentored and loved enough that they have a fighting chance as grown-ass women or men. And, when a predator comes in and takes that away from them, takes their childhood away from them. And it's not even just teenagers. When I think of my friends, so many people I've talked to who have had their childhoods just robbed from them, just taken from them by predatorial men who have just slunk in, men who were friends with their mothers, or men who were related to their fathers, or their very fathers. Isn't that sad? Could you imagine that? And just imagine having your childhood taken away like that. And then people later on accusing you, if that person happened to be a celebrity, and saying, well, you know what? I don't know. What were you wearing? Why were you so hypersexual at 13? Wow, you must be just some slut. And it's just, it's so scary. And when I think about how, when that moment came, when I was looking down at the staircase, knowing exactly what this man was trying to do, and he had a cord around my throat. It was very scary. It was a very scary scenario for me to be in. And for the record, this was over nothing. This was over me calling him out and him being afraid. He was always afraid of being found out. And as I was just looking at it, I just couldn't help but think afterwards. During, I was just thinking, I don't want to die. But afterwards, thinking, I don't know, I thought, why did I keep quiet for so long? Because now if I try to say it, I won't be believed. Or even if, and that's not true, because I did try to say it to a number of people in the beginning. I even said it directly to one person. Her response was, well, he seems nice, and you should be thankful because I don't have a boyfriend. This is a real thing. I showed her the bruises all over my arms. And I know that I'm responsible for going back to him. Of course I know that. But it was more that I was thinking about how I was drowning in some ways in plain sight, and there was nobody really offering me a life preserver or calling him out, even beyond me. They knew what he was doing. And nobody went up to him and said, stop hitting your girlfriend. Nobody did that. Nobody wanted to. And it wasn't like he was an imposing man. It wasn't like he was some scary, authoritative dude. In fact, in town, he was kind of slinking and unassuming and sort of acted sort of cheesy and laid back. And there wasn't a whole lot. Like, most men could have probably taken him out with one fist punch to the face if they felt inclined. Not saying they should have done that. The point is like, I couldn't help but think, like, even though, like, I should have, gotten out of my own volition, it was my responsibility or whatever, there was definitely a part of me that was like, it would be so easy for anyone to call him out on this. People knew. There were people who knew. They may not have known exactly, but they knew. And instead of being like, stop hitting your girlfriend, confronting him, doing whatever they, like, just saying it to him, to the predator, calling him out, shining a light in the room so that, the cockroaches scuttle. Instead, what did they do? They kind of ignored it, shrugged. They didn't want to believe it because there were certain advantages to not believing it. And they just looked at me and they said, well, what did you do? What were you wearing? Well, how did you react? Women can be abusive too. You could be a jerk too. All of these things accurate. Totally can be a jerk. Yeah, sure, totally. The point is that it's like none of them took the basic time it would have taken to Google search how abuse works, how power structures work, and how, my abuser was operating. He was operating under the same the same guide as they all do. He was not behaving in any way outside of exactly how they all do. They groom you. They devalue you. They draw you back in when you try to escape them. They use breadcrumbing. They use gaslighting. They're going to use all the same techniques. And I will never forget that one time where he abused me in front of one of his friends. We were sitting at a table, we were talking, we were interacting casually, having conversation, and he got mad and he poured an entire beer on my head and smashed it on the ground, got kicked out of that restaurant. And the friend, who has known him since he was, 19, is shocked, naturally, because I was very shocked too, because he does this in private, never in public. And also this was in the beginning, and he wasn't super violent by that point. And the friend looked at me, and he, without skipping a beat, asked, "What did you do?" And I don't think there's a better way to illustrate it. Did he go after my abuser and confront him and say, "Why did you do that to her? What were you thinking? You're a violent man. That is not okay. That's not how we treat the women in our society"? No. He walked out with me and tried to interrogate me about all the things I was doing wrong. When people talk about not wanting to come forward, there are so many reasons that we don't. And I think that so many victims of abuse, they don't want... We are never going to be Snow White. We're never going to be pure and clean. We're not going to be gracious angels in the household cowering under a fist. Nor are we going to be, warrior princesses, allegedly like pulling out our swords and refusing to submit when being subjected to abuse. We are neither of these things. We are human beings who love and who got put in a scenario of abuse that nearly tore our lives apart. And anybody who is in a life or death situation, who is trying to survive, an increasingly unstable person, will do whatever she has to do to survive. And any person out there who feels ashamed about that needs to stop. Because we know what the score is. We know what happened. And it was hard for me. I was just as brain foggy as the rest of them, literally equating his rape to me standing up for myself and yelling loudly, "You will not treat me like this." Oh God, I raised my voice. I shouldn't be raising my voice. My mother raised me better than that. You're yelling at me. You're accusing me. God, you're so bad. You're just as bad as me. I don't like hurting people. Average people don't like hurting people. We don't like that. There are times when we feel cornered and threatened that, yes, we hurt people. We push back like boxers. And it happens. But I think human nature in general, we want to help people. We want to love people and we want to support people. But when we're with abusive people, that's what they want to do. They want to hurt us. They want to dispose all of their pain, all of their insecurity, all of their entitlement into you. What they don't tell abuse victims is that they are basically receptacles, and that's what I became. I became a garbage pail that he would come home to and unload all of his things, all the bad stuff into. And I had to open wide and accept it, or be subjected to even worser treatment. And the psychological, emotional, sexual, physical toll that took on me, physical toll, I mean, my goodness, after one of the grotesque rapes, where I became incontinent, which was pretty embarrassing, I mean, there was a long period in time where my entire body, was just, I couldn't move my body. I thought I was dying, of cancer or something. It will destroy your body. You'll end up with autoimmune issues. You'll end up with brain tumors. I'm convinced of it. This will physically kill you, even if it's not physically on a mental, just on the fact that they're hitting you. It absolutely destroys you. And the weaker you get, the more they put into you. And the moment you start to fight back, the worse it's going to become. You are in a room with somebody who will always ante up, who will always, always hit harder, who will always take it to a level, because they will make you submit. They will make you abide by their rules. They are very controlling. And when you do make the choice to leave or to fight back, you are literally facing the very real possibility that you will die. So I want people to understand that next time they say, oh, why didn't she just leave? Or, oh, why did she love the jerk? When you're looking at such severe options, your brain will do anything to help you cope, to help you live, to help you survive. And the sick part is next time you see something like that, please don't look at the woman and ask her, well, what did you do? Instead, why don't you go out and hold that person, that predator, accountable? I know that's something I am going to try to do in the future. Next time that happens and I see that behavior, I'm going to stand up and say something about it. I am not ever going to allow, if I can help it, to see any woman or man, because there are men out there experiencing this too. I'm never going to allow that in front of me ever again, if I can help it. And I think that we as a society can do a whole lot better, educate ourselves. So anyway, that's kind of my addressment of some of these issues. So to summarize, no, it's not a class thing. Abuse happens in every scenario, be it a doctor, a lawyer, or, yes, a porn star. Of course, you can love a jerk. People love jerks all the time. That doesn't, however, mean that it's your fault because you loved a jerk. We love all sorts of people who disappoint and abuse us. And when we get out, and you should praise us, not ask us why. Let's move on to the next question. Why did she stay? She stayed for a lot of reasons, because a big one being that getting out would be incredibly difficult. They will wait until you're knocked up and married before they really start at it. And it can be very scary to get out. And she stays for a lot of reasons. And those reasons irrelevant when we should be paying attention to why was that man abusing her, which is where all of our focus needs to be, frankly. Women abuse too. So who's to say who's what? In domestic violence cases, there's, first off, no such thing. I should have said this way earlier in the podcast. There's no such thing, well, arguably, there's no such thing as mutual abuse. Yes, two people can totally be dog cussing the heck out of each other or whatever and be like, that's mutual. Sure. But there's really no such thing as mutual abuse. There is going to be somebody who is the perpetrator of the abuse, who is enforcing an unrealistic power struggle, and there's going to be somebody who is going to be reacting to that abuse and trying to get out from under that abuse. So mutual abuse is not a thing, and stop making it a thing. There's an abuser, and then there's a person reacting and trying to get away from the abuse. And guess what? It is going to look a little complicated, because I would like to see you being subjected to something on an intense level and see how you handle it and see how you get out from under it. And then ask yourself, was that an adherence to my higher self? Like seriously, like put yourself in my scenario. Say the man is strangling you. How are you going to respond? Are you going to try to be reasonable with him? Are you going to be like, oh, could you please? Could that be? What are you going to do? You're going to fight for your life. You're going to try your hardest to get away from him, and you're going to do whatever you can to survive. I am not going to ever look at a person and say, you participated in that abuse. There's no such thing as mutual abuse. So anyway, also I want people to understand, very statistically common. Very, very, very common. People are being molested as children on an extremely high level. Young women in college are being subjected to sexual assaults and abuse on an extremely high level. And domestic violence is extremely common, as is rape, also extremely common. And if you look at the data, when it comes to criminals committing further activities that are on a much arguably worse level, such as murder or mass shootings, they oftentimes have a tie-in to domestic violence and rape, as in these are things that they are also committing. If we took those things more seriously, say more seriously than we do for a person having a joint, then we would see a massive improvement in our society as far as getting those more serious crimes off our streets. Take women seriously. Stop the rape, stop the abuse, stop blaming the victims. Let's do better. We are in 2021 now. We should be at a better place. Women, we have a woman as a vice president, and things have moved forward in a great way. Men are no longer under the incredibly taxing burden of toxic masculine behaviors. They're finally starting to be self-actualized themselves, growing into amazing three-dimensional people. Women are as well. We are evolving, and we are finally moving away from gender roles into a much more equal society. It's great times to live in, but if we really want to see this momentum continue forward, we're going to have to address this serious, serious, serious issue. I know I would have loved justice. I didn't get it. I am still battling things to try to get away from it, just on a legal level. But I don't want any other woman to feel the way I felt. And I know that right now, millions of them are, and men too. So anyway, this has been My Little Narcissist. I'm your host, Lyra Stone, and I hope this helped a little.